I used to believe betrayal announced itself. I imagined it came with noise, raised voices, slammed doors, names spoken too loudly in the wrong rooms. I thought it would be obvious, undeniable, impossible to miss. I was wrong. The most dangerous betrayal I've ever committed didn't make a sound. It slipped into my life quietly, dressed as comfort. It sat down beside me without asking. And by the time I noticed it was there, it already knew my name. When people ask me who my husband is, I never know where to start. Not because he's complicated, but because he isn't. He's the kind of man people trust instinctively. The kind who doesn't need to raise his voice to be heard. The kind who listens without interrupting. Who remembers small details and never uses them against you later. He never checked my phone. Not once. Even when my screen lit up late at night. Even when I smiled without explaining why. Even when I drifted into silence at dinner, staring at thoughts I didn't know how to translate into words. He trusted me the way children trust gravity, without thinking about it, without questioning whether it would hold. I used to think that kind of trust meant we were invincible. I didn't understand how fragile it actually was. We met years earlier, before life had fully settled into us. Back when love still felt like discovery instead of maintenance. Back when we asked each other questions not because we were polite, but because we genuinely wanted to know the answers. We built our relationship on ordinary things. Shared grocery lists taped to the fridge. Notes scribbled on scraps of paper. Conversations that wandered into the early morning hours without either of us noticing the time. There was no chaos between us. No dramatic highs or lows. Just consistency. I mistook consistency for permanence. Marriage didn't change us overnight. Changed us slowly. In ways I didn't notice until much later. We became efficient. Predictable. Comfortable. Our conversations shortened not because we didn't care, but because we assumed we already knew. How was your day? Fine. Yours? Long. We filled in the rest silently. There was love there. Real love. But there was also something else. A quiet space we stopped stepping into together. And into that space, something new eventually wandered. I don't remember the exact moment it started. That's the unsettling part. There was no clear beginning I can point to and say that's when I crossed the line. Instead, it arrived in fragments. A conversation that went on longer than necessary. A question that felt personal in a way I hadn't felt in a while. A laugh that stayed with me after it ended. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself it was normal. I told myself it meant nothing. But I noticed how my energy shifted afterward. How my thoughts lingered. How I replayed words in my head, wondering what they meant. Wondering what I meant to him. I didn't stop it. That choice, not stopping, would matter later. There was no physical affair. I say that clearly because people always ask. But there was something else, something harder to define and easier to dismiss until it isn't. There was attention. And I was starving for it in ways I hadn't admitted to myself. Not because my husband withheld it, but because I had stopped asking for it honestly. I had learned to swallow certain needs, to tell myself they were unreasonable, to label my restlessness as personal failure instead of unmet desire. When someone else noticed that restlessness, named it, I felt seen. And being seen is intoxicating when you've forgotten how to ask for it at home. At some point, I still can't tell you exactly when my priorities shifted. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Just enough. When something funny happened, I told someone else first. When something hurt me, I processed it somewhere else. When I felt unsure, I looked for reassurance outside the place that was meant to hold me. My husband still got a version of me, just not the whole one. I didn't recognize this as betrayal at the time, because betrayal in my mind was physical. It was touch. It was sex. It was bodies crossing lines. This felt invisible, abstract, easy to justify. But intimacy isn't only about bodies. It's about who gets your unfiltered thoughts, Who hears your fears before you've polished them into something manageable. Who you trust with the parts of yourself that aren't ready for daylight yet. And slowly, quietly, I was handing those parts away. The guilt didn't arrive immediately. It came in waves. First it felt like excitement, then confusion, then a dull, persistent ache I couldn't explain. I'd catch my husband watching me sometimes, not suspiciously, just attentively, as if he sensed something had shifted but didn't know how to name it. "You okay?" he'd ask. "Yeah," I'd say. "Just tired." That sentence became my shield. And my weapon. I think what hurts the most now is remembering how safe he felt. How sure. There is something devastating about betraying someone who never thought to doubt you. He trusted me in ways I didn't even trust myself. And I let that trust sit behind me while I leaned toward something easier. Looking back, I see all the warning signs I ignored. The way I guarded my phone without realizing I was doing it. The way I laughed a little too quickly at messages that weren't meant to matter. The way my husband became background noise in moments when he should have been the center. But hindsight is cruel like that. It hands you clarity only after the damage is done. The night everything began to unravel wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation. No accusation. Just a question, asked softly enough that I almost missed it. "You feel far away lately," he said. "Did I do something?" That question landed heavier than any shout ever could. Because the answer wasn't no. And it wasn't yes. It was something much harder to admit. And that admission would change everything. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to betray my marriage. That's the lie people tell themselves when they want clean edges. When they want to believe that harm only comes from bad intentions. Mine didn't. Mine came from exhaustion. From small dissatisfactions I never named. From a quiet hunger I didn't know how to explain without sounding ungrateful. And so I explained it to myself instead. There is a particular kind of loneliness that exists only inside long relationships. It doesn't look like emptiness. It looks like routine. It looks like knowing exactly how someone will respond before they speak. Like finishing sentences not because you're connected, but because the pattern is familiar. We still loved each other. That part is important. But love had become something we maintained rather than explored. And I didn't know how to say that without sounding like I was asking for too much. I started noticing how rarely we sat facing each other anymore. How often we talk side by side, eyes on separate screens, bodies close but attention elsewhere. How many thoughts I swallowed because they felt inconvenient or indulgent. I told myself this was adulthood. Marriage. Normal. But normal can still ache. When the other person entered my life slowly, subtly, he didn't feel like a threat. He felt like oxygen. He asked questions I hadn't been asked in a long time. Not out of obligation but curiosity. He noticed when my tone changed. When my energy dipped. He remembered details. That alone felt intoxicating. I didn't realize how starved I had been for that kind of attention until it was suddenly offered without effort. I should have stopped it early. That truth sits heavy in my chest now. But at the time, stopping felt unnecessary. Dramatic. Paranoid. Nothing bad had happened yet. I wasn't touching him. I wasn't flirting openly. I wasn't hiding anything, at least not consciously. But something had shifted inside me. And I didn't want to look at it too closely. There's a moment. I remember it clearly, when I realized I was crossing a line. It wasn't during a conversation. It was after. I had just finished talking to him, laughing quietly to myself, feeling light in a way I hadn't in months. And then I looked up and saw my husband across the room. Watching me. Not suspiciously. Not angrily. Just present. Something twisted in my stomach then. A brief, sharp warning. This feels wrong. I ignored it. After that, the justifications came easier. I told myself my husband was busy. Tired. That he wouldn't notice. I told myself I was still loyal. That loyalty lived in actions, not thoughts. I told myself I was allowed to have a private world. What I didn't admit was that I had started protecting that world. I angled my phone away without thinking. I paused conversations when he entered the room. I laughed a little quieter, smiled a little less openly. These were small things, almost invisible, but they added up to a distance I couldn't explain when my husband finally noticed it. "You seem distracted lately," he said one night, gently. "I'm fine," I answered. That was the first time I felt the lie settle into my body. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt practical, easier than the truth. The truth would have required me to say, "I miss feeling wanted. I miss feeling interesting. I don't know how to ask you for that without hurting you." And so I said nothing. Silence felt kinder. I didn't understand that silence is often the cruelest choice. What scares me now is how quickly the emotional shift happened once it started. How natural it felt to turn elsewhere. How my husband, the man I had chosen, the man who trusted me without question, slowly became the person I edited myself for. I brought him the clean version of my thoughts. Someone else got the raw ones. I started to feel two versions of myself existing at the same time. The wife, steady and reliable, and the woman who felt alive again when someone else listened. Holding both at once was exhausting, but I wasn't ready to let either go. Guilt crept in quietly, not as panic, not as fear, as heaviness, as a constant background hum I couldn't turn off. I'd lie in bed next to my husband, listening to his breathing, and feel a strange ache in my chest, part longing, part shame. I loved him, and that made everything worse. People talk about temptation like it's loud. Mine was gentle. It didn't push. It waited. And I walked toward it willingly, telling myself I could turn back any time. That illusion would not last much longer. There's a moment in every quiet betrayal where you sense the cost before you're ready to pay it. For me, it came the night my husband reached for my hand in bed. Something he hadn't done in a while, and I hesitated. Just for a second. But seconds matter. I felt it then. The distance wasn't theoretical anymore. It was physical. And it was my fault. I wish I could tell you I stopped right there. I didn't. Because stopping would have required me to face what I was doing. And I wasn't ready to see myself that clearly. Not yet. There is a moment in every quiet betrayal when denial becomes effort. You can still pretend nothing is happening, but pretending starts to cost you something. For me, that cost was presence. The other man didn't arrive like temptation. He arrived like familiarity. Like someone who already knew how to sit beside me without demanding anything. Someone who didn't rush me, didn't push, didn't ask for more than I was willing to give. Which made giving feel voluntary instead of dangerous. That's how I justified it. I wasn't being taken. I was choosing. And choice feels innocent when you don't look too closely at what you're choosing instead of. Our conversations deepened without announcement. They slipped past small talk and settled into something heavier. Stories about childhood, disappointments we laughed about but hadn't fully forgiven. The quiet fears we rarely said out loud. He listened like time didn't exist. And I responded like someone who had been waiting to be heard. I told myself this was connection. I didn't ask what kind. At home I became careful. Not cold, just edited. I noticed how often I paused before answering my husband, weighing which parts of my thoughts were worth sharing and which felt easier to keep. I had never done that before. With him I had always been whole. Now I was selective. That should have scared me more than it did. The thing about emotional intimacy is that it teaches your body before your mind catches up. I felt lighter after talking to him. Energized. More myself. Then guilt would settle in slow and heavy, once I was alone again. I'd lie in bed beside my husband, listening to the familiar rhythm of his breathing, and feel like I was occupying a space I hadn't fully earned that day. I loved him. That truth never disappeared. It just stopped being enough to anchor me. The line moved gradually. What once felt like too much became normal. A longer conversation. A more personal question. A pause before I closed my phone. Each time I told myself I hadn't crossed anything yet. Yet is a dangerous word. I started thinking about the other man when I wasn't with him, wondering what he would say about things that happened during my day. Imagining his reactions before I even had them. That realization hit me harder than any flirtation could have, because it meant he had entered my inner world, and my husband hadn't been invited. There was a night, I remember it clearly, when I laughed out loud at something he said. Not quietly, not politely, out loud. My husband was in the same room. He looked up at me surprised then smiled. "What's funny?" he asked. I hesitated. "Just something I read," I said. That lie didn't protect anything. It just widened the distance. I started noticing how much effort it took to maintain the separation. How many small calculations my day now required. Who knew what? Who got which version of me? How much truth I could afford in each space. Love had never felt like this before. It had never required management. Sometimes I'd catch myself imagining what it would feel like to confess everything. Not because I wanted to hurt my husband, but because I was tired. Tired of holding the tension. Tired of splitting myself in two. But confession felt too final. Too destructive. So I chose silence instead. The other man never asked me to leave my marriage. That made it easier to stay. He didn't push boundaries. He respected them, right up until I blurred them myself. I think part of me needed him to be innocent so I could stay convinced that I was too. One afternoon he asked me something simple. "Are you happy?" The question landed harder than it should have, because I didn't know how to answer it honestly without unraveling everything. "I think so," I said. I didn't believe it. What I didn't want to admit, not yet, was that happiness isn't just about comfort. It's about honesty. And I was no longer being honest with the person who deserved it most. There's a particular kind of shame that comes with realizing you are the source of your own confusion. That you can't blame neglect or cruelty or circumstance. Only your own avoidance. I felt it every time my husband reached for me and I responded half a second too late. Every time I chose peace over truth. Every time I convinced myself that as long as I didn't touch another body, I was still faithful. The illusion began to crack the night my husband asked again, quietly, "Are we okay?" I looked at him, really looked, and saw concern instead of certainty. That was new. Something in me shifted then. Not enough to stop, but enough to know I was running out of space to hide. I went to bed that night knowing something had to change. I just didn't yet know how painful that change would be, or how much damage had already been done. There's a moment when you realize you can't unknow what you know. When pretending becomes harder than facing the truth. I reached that moment slowly, and then all at once. The guilt stopped being abstract. It stopped hovering quietly in the background and began demanding attention. It followed me into every room. Into the shower. Into bed. Into conversations that used to feel effortless. I could feel it in my body. A tightness in my chest, a constant restlessness I couldn't explain away anymore. I had crossed a line. Not dramatically, not publicly, but definitively. What frightened me most was how normal everything still looked from the outside. We still ate dinner together, still talked about work, still planned weekends. My husband laughed at my jokes, touched my arm when he passed me in the kitchen, kissed me goodnight without hesitation. And every time he did, the weight inside me grew heavier, because I knew something he didn't. And that knowledge changed everything. The other man had become a presence I couldn't ignore. Not because he demanded more, he never did. But because I had given him space inside me that no longer felt temporary. I noticed how quickly I turned to my phone when I felt unsettled. How instinctive it had become to seek his voice, his perspective, his validation. That scared me more than attraction ever could. Because attraction fades. Dependency doesn't. I started asking myself questions I didn't want to answer. If my husband found out everything, would he forgive me? Did I even deserve forgiveness? Had I already destroyed something essential without realizing it? These questions didn't bring clarity. They brought panic. There were moments when I almost confessed. Standing in the kitchen watching my husband make coffee the way he always did, careful, unhurried. I'd feel the words rise in my throat. I'd imagine telling him. Imagine the hurt on his face. Imagine the silence afterward. And I'd swallow the truth back down. Because once spoken, it couldn't be undone. I told myself I was protecting him. That this was my burden to carry. That as long as I stopped now, the damage could remain contained. That was another lie. Damage doesn't stay contained just because you ask it to. The turning point didn't come from confrontation. It came from exhaustion. I was tired of monitoring myself. Tired of managing two emotional lives. Tired of the constant low-level anxiety that never fully disappeared. I was tired of being divided. One night, lying in bed beside my husband, I noticed he was awake. Not moving. Not scrolling. Just staring at the ceiling. "You okay?" I asked. He hesitated. "I was going to ask you the same thing," he said. Something in his voice, restrained, careful, broke through my remaining defenses. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was concern. "I feel like I'm losing you," he said quietly. The words landed like a confession of their own. I turned toward him, heart racing. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. "You're here," he said. "But you're not with me. And I don't know why." That was the moment I understood there was no version of this where no one got hurt. He was already hurting. I didn't confess everything that night. But I didn't lie either. I told him I'd been distant. That I felt disconnected. That I didn't know how to talk about it. The truth hovered between us, unspoken but present. I saw it in his eyes. He knew there was more. After that, everything felt fragile. Every interaction carried weight. Every pause felt loaded. I became hyper-aware of myself, of my tone, my touch, my absence. And still, the pull toward the other man hadn't fully released its grip. That terrified me. I realized then that stopping contact wasn't enough. The damage wasn't just in what I was doing. It was in what I had already let happen. I had changed, and I didn't yet know how to change back. There is a particular grief that comes with realizing you are the villain in your own story. Not because you intended harm, but because you avoided discomfort for too long. I sat with that grief quietly, alone, night after night, knowing that a reckoning was coming, knowing I was running out of time. The final choice approached without urgency, without drama, just inevitability. I would either tell the whole truth, or I would lose myself completely, and possibly him. I used to think confession would feel like relief, like a deep breath after holding my lungs tight for too long, like finally putting something heavy down. It didn't. It felt like standing still while the ground gave way beneath me. The moment arrived without ceremony. No plan. No preparation. No perfect timing. Just a quiet evening that felt too fragile to survive another lie. We were sitting together, close but not touching. The room was dim, the kind of light that makes everything feel more honest than you intend. My husband looked at me, really looked, and said softly, "I need you to tell me the truth, whatever it is." There was no anger in his voice. That made it worse. I opened my mouth and nothing came out. All the words I had rehearsed scattered, useless. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "I don't know how to say this," I whispered. He nodded slowly. "Just say it." That was the moment I understood there would be no version of this where I stayed clean. Truth is never gentle when it's been delayed. "I let someone else get too close," I said. The sentence sounded smaller out loud than it felt inside me. Almost harmless. But his body reacted before his mind caught up. I saw it in his shoulders, in the way his breath changed. "What do you mean?" he asked. And I knew I couldn't hide behind vague words anymore. I told him, not every message, not every moment, but enough. Enough for him to understand that I had given emotional space, intimacy, priority to someone who was not him. Enough for him to understand that the betrayal wasn't accidental. It was chosen. He didn't interrupt me. He didn't raise his voice. He just listened. And that silence, that unbearable, respectful silence, hurt more than any anger could have. When I finished, he didn't speak right away. He stared at the floor, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. I wanted to reach for him. I didn't. I no longer knew what I was allowed to do. Did you love him? He finally asked. The question broke something in me. No, I said immediately. No, I never loved him. He nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't lift. That doesn't make it better, he said. He was right. He asked questions then. Careful ones. Painful ones. How long? Did you ever think about leaving? Was I ever enough for you? There are no good answers to questions like that. Only honest ones. And honesty doesn't soften the blow. It sharpens it. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were red but dry. I trusted you, he said quietly. Not as an accusation, as a fact. I felt that sentence settle into my bones. Because trust, once broken, doesn't shatter loudly. Sinks. We sat there for a long time after that. No touching. No comforting. Just space filled with the weight of what had been said. I realized then that confession isn't the end of betrayal. It's the beginning of consequences. That night, we slept on opposite sides of the bed. Not because he asked me to move, but because neither of us knew how to close the distance safely. Every movement felt wrong. Every breath felt too loud. I stared at the ceiling, replaying everything I should have said sooner. Everything I should have done differently. Regret is merciless that way. In the days that followed, time moved strangely. Some moments stretched endlessly. Others vanished without warning. We talked but carefully, as if any wrong word might cause something else to collapse. He oscillated between numbness and quiet grief. I watched him process my betrayal in real time. And there was nothing I could do to make it easier. That was the hardest part. Realizing that love doesn't give you the power to undo harm. It only gives you the responsibility to face it. He asked me to cut off all contact. I did. Immediately. Completely. Not because he demanded it, but because anything less would have been another betrayal. Still, ending it didn't end the damage. It only stopped it from spreading further. One night, weeks later, he said something that still echoes in my mind. I don't know who I am to you anymore. That sentence terrified me more than the possibility of losing him, because it meant I had changed the way he saw himself. And that is a loss that doesn't belong only to the person who was betrayed. I learned then that betrayal doesn't just break trust. It fractures identity. For both people. We didn't decide anything right away. No ultimatums. No promises. No declarations about the future. Just survival. Just showing up to the next conversation. Just choosing not to run. I wanted forgiveness, but I didn't ask for it. Because forgiveness isn't something you request on a timeline. It's something someone offers or doesn't, when they're ready. And I had already taken too much. What stayed with me most was the quiet. The absence of certainty. The way love felt suddenly fragile instead of grounding. I had always thought honesty would save us. I hadn't realized how much damage had already been done by the time I chose it. Life doesn't stop after a confession. That was something I didn't understand until I was standing inside the aftermath, realizing the world hadn't paused to accommodate our pain. Morning still came. Coffee still brewed. Bills still needed to be paid. But everything felt different. He looked different. I sounded different even to myself. Truth doesn't cleanse. It exposes. The days after I told him felt unreal. We moved around each other carefully, like strangers sharing a space neither of us fully owned anymore. Conversations were cautious. Touch was hesitant when it happened at all. Sometimes he would reach for me without thinking, then stop himself halfway. That pause hurt more than rejection, because it meant trust no longer moved automatically. I learned quickly that remorse doesn't look the way people imagine. It isn't dramatic. It isn't constant tears or grand apologies. It's waking up every day knowing you are the reason someone you love now feels unsafe. And having to live with that knowledge quietly. He asked for space. Not distance. Just room to think without me hovering, without my guilt pressing against his healing. I gave it to him. Or at least I tried. Giving space when you're terrified of being left is its own kind of discipline. Some nights he slept beside me. Some nights he didn't. On the nights he stayed, I lay awake listening to his breathing, wondering what thoughts kept him silent, wondering whether he was picturing life without me. I never asked, because I was afraid of the answer. We started talking again, not like before, but honestly, painfully honestly. He told me things I had never heard him say, that he felt foolish for trusting so completely, that he questioned his own worth, that he wondered whether he had missed something obvious. Every word cut, because his pain wasn't abstract. It was specific, and I had caused it. I wanted to explain myself, to say I hadn't meant to hurt him, that I had felt lonely too, that I hadn't stopped loving him. But explanations sounded like excuses now, so instead I listened. That was all I was allowed to do. Trust doesn't rebuild the way it's broken. There is no dramatic turning point, no moment where everything suddenly feels safe again. There are only small decisions. To answer honestly when it would be easier to deflect. To stay present when discomfort urges you to escape. To allow someone to see you fully even when you hate what they see. I cut contact completely with the other man. Not as a gesture. Not as a promise. As a necessity. I realized something uncomfortable in the process. That letting go wasn't as hard as I had feared. What I missed wasn't him. It was the version of myself I had felt around him. That realization forced me to confront a deeper truth. I hadn't betrayed my marriage because of another person. I had betrayed it because I didn't know how to ask for what I needed honestly. There were days when my husband looked at me with something close to tenderness. Those days felt like borrowed time. There were other days when he was distant, withdrawn, unreachable. Those days reminded me that healing doesn't move in straight lines. Once, during a long silence, he said quietly, "I don't know if I'll ever trust you the same way again." I nodded, because asking for that would have been selfish. Trust, once broken, doesn't return unchanged. If it comes back at all, it comes back different. I started to understand something important during that time. Staying together is not the same as repairing. Love alone is not enough. Repair requires humility, patience, a willingness to be uncomfortable for longer than feels fair. And it requires accepting that forgiveness may never come. There were moments when I wondered whether leaving would be kinder, whether my presence was a constant reminder of pain he didn't deserve to carry. But he didn't ask me to go. And I didn't ask him to stay. We let time do what words couldn't. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. Not back to what we were, but towards something more honest. We talked about needs we had never named. About expectations we had assumed instead of discussed. About how easily silence had replaced vulnerability. Those conversations were harder than the confession itself, because they required us to see each other without illusions. I learned to sit with my shame without letting it turn into self-pity. I learned that guilt is only useful if it leads to change. I learned that accountability doesn't end once the truth is spoken. It begins there. I don't know yet how this story ends. I know that we are still here. Still choosing every day whether to continue. Still learning how to rebuild something that will never look the same. What I do know is this: betrayal doesn't end when you confess. It echoes. And healing is not about erasing those echoes. It's about learning how to live honestly despite them. Time doesn't heal everything. That's another comforting lie we tell ourselves. Time doesn't heal, it reveals. It shows you what can live with you. Что никогда не исчезнет, просто станет тише. We stayed. That's the fact people always want first. Yes, we stayed together. But not in the way we were before. Something essential had shifted, and no amount of effort could return us to the version of ourselves that existed before the truth. That version was gone. Rebuilding didn't feel like progress. It felt like excavation. We had to dig through years of assumptions, unspoken needs, quiet resentments we hadn't even realized we were carrying. We talked about things we'd avoided for a long time. About loneliness. About expectations we never said out loud. About how easily love can turn into autopilot if you're not paying attention. Those conversations were harder than the confession itself, because they forced us to see not just what I had done, but what we had both ignored. Trust came back slowly. Not fully. Not innocently. It returned in fragments. In questions instead of assumptions. In pauses where certainty used to live. In moments where my husband chose to believe me, consciously, instead of instinctively. That choice cost him something every time. I never forgot that. There are things I carry now that I didn't before. An awareness of how easily I can drift. A responsibility to speak before silence becomes damage. A permanent understanding that love doesn't protect you from hurting someone. Only honesty does. I don't get to forget what I did just because we survived it. Survival isn't absolution. Sometimes late at night I still think about the moment before everything broke. That narrow space where I could have spoken sooner. Asked for what I needed. Chosen discomfort over avoidance. I don't romanticize that moment. I mourn it. What surprised me most wasn't how fragile love turned out to be. It was how resilient it could become. If both people were willing to sit inside the wreckage without pretending it wasn't there. We didn't rebuild what we lost. We built something else. Something slower. More cautious. More honest. And yes, more scarred. There are still days when I catch a look in his eyes. Not accusation. Memory. A reminder of what he had to survive because of me. On those days I don't defend myself. I don't explain. I just stay present. Because accountability doesn't expire. People ask me now what betrayal looks like. They expect a story about temptation. About passion. About desire. I tell them this instead. Betrayal looks like silence. Like choosing comfort over truth. Like letting someone else become the place you land emotionally, while telling yourself it doesn't count. It counts. Every time. If you are listening to this and you feel that quiet drift beginning, please don't wait. Don't wait for it to become heavy. Don't wait for it to require forgiveness. Don't wait until honesty costs more than it needs to. Say something early. Say it badly if you have to. But say it before silence becomes a fracture. This story isn't about redemption. It's about responsibility. It's about learning that love isn't proven by how much you feel, but by how willing you are to be seen, even when it's uncomfortable. This is my confession. Not because I want absolution, but because some truths deserve to be spoken, so someone else might stop before they cross the line I didn't see in time.